Hey guys. Um, yeah, my name's Steve. I have a lot to get through in the next 30 minutes, so I'm just going to get right into it. So the name of my talk is How to Think Like a Visual Designer. I'm a visual designer, and I thought it'd be cool to give a glimpse of my process when designing a website from scratch using already existing content. And I'll try my best to explain my process as well, and I'll give plenty of tips along the way. And hopefully this will give you a few ideas you can take home and apply to your own site. So I'm going to be using a real world example of a site I recently redesigned. So we're going to be taking a look at the marketing site for TUPLE. TUPLE is a remote pair programming tool for Mac. It's sort of built around like this idea of a replacement to tools like Screen Hero. It was acquired and killed by Slack, and then there's like other pairing tools out there that they're not necessarily designed for developers in mind. Tuple was created by my friends Ben Ornstein, Joel Sutherland, and Spencer Dixon. I had to include this photo because it kind of looks like a father-son thing. 'Cause and yeah, so they asked me if I can help them redesign their site to better align with their messaging and positioning. And I thought it would make a great case study. So to kick things off, let's just take a look at our content. So Ben sent me this Google Doc with all the content they wanted on their new site. Now, I want to emphasize the importance of content first. Like, you need to keep in mind that like content is design. You want like content to define the layout and elements in the design rather than the other way around. Like have the design dictate the content, and this will make it easier to tell your story and guide both yours and your own goals. So let's take a look. So Ben structured this content and understanding there's probably going to be like a hero with a call to action. He wanted to include like a demo video that he put together, which is great. He highlights a few key features. Also not shown here were like a few testimonials that he found on Twitter. So like a lot of common content you'd expect to see on a site like this. And so we're going to try and explore ways to structure this in a more meaningful way. Now, if I were to give all this content to a developer, they might design something that looks like this. In fact, some of you might be thinking, yeah, that looks pretty good. I wouldn't change a thing. And yeah, there's like a general sense of hierarchy here. It's using a lot of bootstrap defaults, which I see many developers relying on. And it's a good starting point, but it makes everything look more or less the same. Just not as polished as something maybe a designer would put together. So we're going to see what we can do to bring this to the next level. So starting at the top, hierarchy-wise, this is fine, but visually it's not that interesting. It doesn't really draw me in or look super trustworthy at this point. So I'm going to get into like styling details in a bit, but let's just kind of think about the layout a bit. So first, explore more than one layout idea. Like one thing I've observed with developer designs is like just over the years, they center everything. This is just my own interpretation of what a dev would do, but I see this a lot. And so the headline's centered, the subheadings are centered, all these features are center aligned. All the testimonials are they're all grouped together and centered. So I see this happening all the time. But there's a lot of ways you can structure here. You could left align it. Nothing crazy. You can add a visual. There's a ton of ways you can position that. You can do a side-by-side treatment. You can flip it so the headline's on the right and the image is on the left, and you could stack it so the headline's on top and the visuals on the bottom. And if you're having a hard time visualizing some of these ideas, you can check out. I go to landbook.com, land-book.com for inspiration, and you can probably find an example for every one of these ideas and more. Just by quickly skimming through these, I was able to find like a layout with this side-by-side treatment, and here's a stack version with the title on top and a nice illustration at the bottom, and you can do the image on the left, and these are just like you can either do a photography, you can do an illustration, you can do this cool collage thing they have going on here. And the point I'm trying to emphasize is explore more than one idea, explore plenty of options. And I consider every one of these things when I work on a project like this, and don't overinvest either. It's really easy to explore these ideas with like a pen and paper to narrow down your decision making. For this particular design, I wanted something a little more abstract, so I thought illustrating something would be the best way to communicate that. So I went ahead and did this side-by-side approach, and I made this illustration. I thought it was a nice way to communicate the product. It's got the two people sharing a screen in different locations, indicated by the landmarks and the night and the day, the contrast of the night and day. Now, obviously, not everyone can draw. You can always hire an illustrator. You can browse on Dribble for like a style you like, and then pay an illustrator a few $100s probably. If you literally have no budget at all, definitely check out Undraw. So it's like MIT licensed illustrations by her name's Katerina Lipitsuni. You can even adjust like the colors up on the top right there, and kind of go along with your own brand. So if you want to try drawing something yourself, I found this great tutorial on the internet. So if you're feeling creative, give it a try. It worked for me. Like one thing that designers do that I feel like a lot of devs won't think of is increase the size of the image to overlap other parts, like overlap the text and just the overall page container. So like I see devs relying too much on the grid, probably for simplicity. They don't want to get into the absolute positioning required to achieve this, but it does make things a little bit more interesting, and these little details go a long way. Now this illustration, it's starting to give the site a little bit more personality, but you can't just rely on that to carry your brand. There's a few other important elements you want to think of. So one is font choice. So if you want more of like a formal, conservative look, you can go with a nice serif. If it's something a little more playful, you can go with like a rounded font. For like a plain clean look, you can go with a nice neutral sans serif. And there's a lot of ways about going to discover new fonts. Like the way I mostly discover new fonts is I'll take a look at the dev tools. I'll learn about like a new font. Maybe I'll find a site on like Landbook and I'll take a peek at the dev tools. But I don't just stop there. Once I find that font, I'll Google it, and then that usually take me to the Foundry. So these are like the companies that design the fonts, and usually they have a good catalog of great fonts worth checking out there. And I've been doing this for a few years. I have a decent collection of fonts that I go back to, and here's a few of my personal favorites. I'll share these slides afterwards, by the way, so you don't have to write these down right now if you care to, but I'll share them on Twitter or something after this so you can review them. A few of them are free, a few of them are licensed, some of them are really expensive, some of them are with a service like Adobe Fonts or something, so yeah. I quite like this font called Graphic. It's clean and generally quite neutral, so it's pretty versatile in that sense. Now keep in mind that not all fonts are transferable. You may need to adjust the weight and size depending. Some fonts, the bold weight is really bold, and when you go to a different font, you might need to adjust it to a medium or a semi-bold. So play around with that. So this was a bit bigger, so I made it a bit smaller. So another thing that defines personality is color. Color is another big factor. Now, most designers, they kind of trust their gut and eyeball the colors. That can be pretty messy. Designers are pretty messy in that sense. I personally just rely on Tailwind colors. Tailwind's this framework by this guy I know. I think he's here. Please introduce me if you see him around. And from there, I would just trust my gut from these too. But just starting from a limited set of colors, like the Tailwind colors is a good starting point. Colors like blue and indigo and teal, they're all pretty in right now. So they're kind of a safe choice. And I know I'm biased because I did pick these colors, but I think there's enough there's enough range with these where I don't have to deviate these. I've been using them since we've kind of nailed these colors down, and I haven't really had to deviate from them at all. And I would just pick one color, then trying to mix colors up. Colors can be pretty tricky to work with, so I wouldn't try to complicate it. So, I'm just going to work with the indigo because that's the brand color, and I'm just going to use that for all our call to actions and things. So another personality identifier is corner radius. So, when I say corner, I mean the stuff you see around buttons and inputs, and a soft radius like this is pretty neutral. If you're going to go with a more serious tone, you can drop the radius altogether, go with that sharper look, and a more playful tone, you can round the corners completely. For this, I'm just going to go with the heavily rounded corner because not fully rounded, but heavily rounded. Another thing that I often see developers relying too much on is size to create contrast. So it does create contrast, but designers will often use color and weight as well. So we can use a lighter but still accessible gray for this subheading. Yeah, you can see that change. It's subtle. So I'm using a Tailwind 900 gray for the headline, and then like a 700 for the subheadline. And then, we can use weight to put more emphasis on the inputs, like supporting text. Now, one thing I'm starting to see with developers in more recent years is like they're starting to grasp that like space is good. I'm starting to see that they're consciously using space to, give their layout more room to breathe. So bravo, that's good step in the right direction. But sometimes they overlook space for like, individual elements, like buttons and inputs. So, like screen sizes are getting larger. So, we have all this extra space we can utilize. So making elements much more clear and easy to find. So I'm going to bump up the overall height of the input there. Just really give that text room to breathe. And that might look like a bit aggressive, but like in context of the rest of the page, it feels pretty good. And because that element's pretty flat, like the input, as in it doesn't have any like gradients or shadows, it lacks depth, which it's a nice visual cue to make something appear more clickable, and it brings more attention to it. But even with flat design, you can have a little bit of depth. So one thing to keep in mind that in general, lighter elements tend to feel closer and darker elements feel a little more further away. So if you want to make something feel a little more inset on a light background like this, you can make it a subtle off-white. Be careful. There's like a fine line between like looking disabled and looking clickable. For this, I'm just using like Tailwind 100 for the gray there. So it's like a nice subtle gray there. So, and then I use like a 300 for like the border just to define it a bit more. Now, if you have a headline that like breaks up nicely like this one, you can add color to half of it. This is just a nice way to put emphasis on keywords and incorporate the brand color to it. And these are just some of the little details that designers are thinking of. So just trying to find opportunities to add small, like non-offensive hints of personality and nothing too in your face. So. Okay, let's take a look at the demo video. I've seen developer sites do this where it's like basically fill the entire page width container. So you can click it and watch it in line. It certainly stands out, but if it's not super important, it really prevents anything else from standing out. And this is just in our piece of supporting content. So stop relying on size and positioning to create your hierarchy. You can always use space and color to create like a nice contrast. And so I'm going to explore a few ways of how we can do that with this video. So to start, we're going to reduce the size of the video, and that's a bit aggressive, but I don't want to watch the video in line at that size. So I was thinking make it more of like an embeddable video, make it more of like a visual element that you can click and it would open into a modal. So to do that, we first need to make it look more like a click target instead of like an embedded video. So the first thing I did was I grabbed a screenshot of Ben, like a nice screenshot. Spend some time doing this. If you're going to do something like this, spend some time because it's surprisingly hard to find like a single frame in a video where their face doesn't look stupid. And since this is a click target, it might be helpful to give it the same rounded corner treatment we use on the buttons. It's a nice subtle visual cue. It's great for consistency. And yeah, we removed all those playing options. That was a nice visual cue to make it look clickable. So we can add a more like stylized play icon. You can get something like this from like any icon set. Like I'm sure Font Awesome has something like that. And I put it in the corner there so I'm not like blocking Ben's personable face. And it still manages to look clickable. And then just to give it a little bit more depth, I added a box shadow to it. I just use like Tailwind default shadows. Like I can go into the anatomy of a box shadow, but I had to cut stuff to keep it within a half hour. So just use the Tailwind defaults. So yeah, now that reduces a lot of vertical space, but now we have all this horizontal space. So one thing I think it's important for designers to understand is that hierarchy doesn't need to be like a top to bottom approach to work. You can associate these elements with like a left to right approach. Just to better associate them, you can contain them. So like I mentioned earlier, use like a combination of size and space and color to create a balance in your design. And so since we reduced the size, it de-emphasized it a bit, we can use like a bold color to just elevate it a bit more. So just to bring more, I can use like that dark indigo color for like our brand color just to bring it out a bit more. Obviously that looks stupid because we invert the text. Now, you may notice that the secondary text it's a little de-emphasized using size and color. Now I already mentioned that like using color to reduce contrast, it's a good thing. I talked about that in the headline. And we used a lighter gray there. And that made sense because it was on a white background. But now we're on a colored background, right? And gray text, it always looks a bit off on a colored background. You need to consider that what we're trying to achieve is reduce contrast, and that you want the text to look closer to the background color, not gray. So in order to do that, you can sample the background color and just adjust the saturation and lightness until it looks right. So this is an HSB picker. It's what you get for with dev tools or graphical editing tools. And I would just drag the picker to the top left corner, and the end result looks something like this. Yeah, so it's a subtle change, but it makes a big difference. And Tailwind already considers this. I just use a lighter color. So that's looking interesting. Now, I always like to find opportunities to overlap elements just to give the page a little more depth. So I find this is a great opportunity because it's so narrow. So you can offset the video image with negative margins. And yeah, and that box shadow is nice. It makes it look much more clickable. And yeah, now we made it a bit tighter now. So I'm gonna make the font a bit smaller. You don't need to supersize the every title to make it clear that it's a title. I think the proximity alone does the job of associating with the video and that it's a title for the video, so we can make that a bit smaller. Then let's just see what that looks like in line with the rest of our design. So it's coming along now. And let's move down to, it kind of breaks up the page nicely too as you scroll beyond the fold. So let's move on to the features section. So when it comes to organizing features like this, I see this too often, and that's features organized in 3 or 4 columns. Depending on the amount of features there is, of course. They usually have a font awesome icon blowing up way more than its intended size. And again, everything's centered. There's not necessarily anything wrong with this, but I'll share with you how a designer might approach this and sort of explain my thinking. So first of all, don't blow up the icons. When you work with icon packs, they're all have this they're all intended for an in-app experience. More often you'd see them next to small text or a navigation element. So what I'm trying to say is they lack a lot of details that a traditional marketing icon will have. And they don't really look that great when they're blown up 3-4 times their intended size. So I'm not saying don't use these for this purpose, just maybe make them a bit smaller. Something like 40 pixels max should suffice. Another thing designers would do, align text with readability in mind. So center alignment might be great for headlines or short blocks of text that wrap once. But for something that's more than 2 or 3 lines, I would always left align it. Now we already talked about reducing contrast. I think this is a good example because it's hard to see projected. It looks great on my Retina screen, but just making the supporting text a bit lighter than the headlines to make the headlines pop a bit more. Also, the icons. I'm using Font Awesome icons here. I don't want to poo-poo on Font Awesome, but they are overused by developers because they're free. They're sort of the go-to set. There's a few other packs worth checking out. A few of them are my own. Some of them are some of them are my own. Some of them are more recommended by designers. I think they're great. And some of them are better suited for marketing sites like this. So I ended up going with one of my own sets. It's publicly available. It's part of the Refactoring UI complete package. It's sort of fun because they have this duotone treatment, so you can pick 2 shades from your palette and apply that to your design. So yep. So I use those for this, and just with these 4 changes that we made to this section, it's already starting to look like something like a designer would design. So let's explore a few more options with this layout, sort of like we did with the hero. Just try to restructure this a bit. So if content lends itself to it, try to break it up into a few sections by finding related groupings. So for example, when I was working on this, I noticed that a lot of these features were more performance and tech related, and then some of them were workflow and experience related. So I encourage Ben to revisit the content a bit, add a bit more, some additional description text to go with the additional section we have here. But also switch up the layout, right? So let's take a look at this first section and see how we can structure this a bit instead of using just 3 columns. So first we can stack the features, and that gives us room to be creative with, and here we can use visual elements like we've already talked about. So I've talked about using maybe a photo or an illustration, or you can grab a screenshot from your product that highlights specific features. Alternatively, you can use optional content. So I think testimonials are great for that. they're great to fill spaces like this, and if you don't have one, they're easy to get by asking an existing customer. Fortunately, we have a few here that we've already talked about, so I'm just going to grab like the first one by Adam on the top left there. Now, I'm not just going to plop this in here because that looks stupid, but it's it's in the middle of this nicely polished new design, so let's try to be creative with that. So first, like, you can still get rid of all the Twitter styling, and we'll come back to Twitter in a bit, but like, let's get rid of all that Twitter styling so it's more consistent with everywhere else. So I've already, so I'm going to change the font so it's the same font we're using everywhere else. And I've already talked about, giving elements more space. So we're going to do the same thing here. Same goes for font size. So, we're going to bump the font size up so it's something more proportionate to everything else. I'm using the same font size as like that supporting text in the top left there. And I always like to italicize quotes. I find it has like more of a conversational tone. And since this is a quote, we can add some quotes to it. I always like to get creative with like quotation marks. So, try to make them like a visual element. So using like size and color and just position to make it a little more unambiguous. And I made this one a bit larger and just kind of tucked it behind the top there, and it looks nice. And if you have a great photo to work with, use it. This is a photo of Adam giving a talk. Makes him look a little more authoritative and reputable. So, I'm just gonna add his name back. So we had the Twitter styling there before, so we removed that once we replaced the photo. So I'm gonna add the name back to the bottom there, and just replace his Twitter with just his title. If the testimonial comes from someone who like represents like a organization, include that. And if it has a nice logo, and then I'm gonna add the Twitter back, so you can click and actually see the source it came from to make it look like it's legit. So yeah, it still looks like a tweet, but it's just more style with the rest of the page. Okay, so now we can see how it looks with the rest of the page. It's coming along now. Now, one thing a lot of designers will do with marketing pages like this is they'll switch up the background. So it's just a great way to make the page a little bit more interesting as you scroll. So the idea is to like alternate between like a white, a light gray, a dark gray, maybe your brand color. So since we've already used like the white in the hero, and we use the indigo on that one ribbon with the video, we can use like an off-white in this section. Just for a cleaner look, we're going to replace that border around the testimonial with a box shadow. Again, just using Tailwind defaults for that. It makes it pop a little bit more and looks a bit cleaner. Just a great way to add distinction to something without like adding a border. Yeah, and now that we have some differentiation with this in this next section here, it sounds repetitive. So I'm just going to keep this section as it is, and it just breaks the page up nicely now. So. Let's move on to the testimonial section. So first I'm just going to isolate that. And, we've already used that testimonial from Adam, so now we've got like a nice even number to work with. I find it's always easier to work with multiples. And let's apply the same styling as the testimonial above. So it's the same everything. I can't get a photo for all these testimonials, so I kept the Twitter avatar there. So it's kind of like a mini version of the above testimonial. Now, yeah, we have all these different heights because all the testimonials are different lengths. So, so instead of letting this happen, you want to control the shape and size. So, you can use a combination of like flexbox, using like flexbox columns and flex grow to give them like the same height. By the way, this site is live, so you can actually look at the code for this if you want and see how that's all done. It's all coded in Tailwind too, so you don't have to look at the CSS. You can just look at the HTML. And these borders, they tend to make the design look pretty busy. So I'm going to reduce that by just removing the containers and putting them into like a nice quadrant with a single border. That looks a bit cleaner. There it is with the rest of the design. So it's coming along. Now, I've already talked about like rotating the background. So, I use like a cycle between like a white and indigo, a light gray and a white. So I can probably come back to the indigo. So I'm going to do that here. Now the indigo I've been using, it's pretty dark. I would consider it a dark UI. And there's a few things you want to consider with that. So there's sort of this misconception that like dark UI is just like the inverted version of the light UI. Now, there's not a significant amount of like background elements in the example we're using, so I'm going to take a look at another example that I recently shared on Twitter, but just to illustrate my point a bit more and explain it a bit more. So here we have a light UI, which is relatively flat, and if um, if you remove a lot of the visual cues, like the gradients and the box shadows, it looks, yeah, so it looks pretty flat. So as I mentioned earlier, to achieve depth with flat design, like you want like light objects, they tend to feel like closer to us, where darker objects feel a little bit further away. So in the example here, like the bottom part is our lightest and the top part is our darkest. And of course we have like a bunch of other visual elements like the borders and the inputs, just to give it that more of a perceived depth. So the common mistake I see is that you invert everything. So our lightest becomes its darkest and our darkest becomes the lightest, right? But you need to keep in mind that like with dark UIs, you want to use the same visual cues as we have with like light UIs. So what you want to do is like you want the lightest background element. It still needs to be the lightest element on the dark UI, and the darkest still needs to be the darkest. So if we take a look at the UI we're working on, the only background element is the border. So to give it the same visual cue as the light version, we need to make it darker, right? So that's how it works for background elements. But for foreground elements like type and iconography, that's where you do want to invert everything. So just at least have like higher contrast on the dark background. So if you take a look at our light UI, so here you can see that the text it's the darkest, and the visual elements like the Twitter icon and the quote, they're a bit more subtle in the background. So to invert that, we need to make the text the lightest and the icons just a bit lighter than the background itself. So that's what that looks like on the dark UI. And lastly, these avatars, there's a little bit of, we can't control like user uploaded images, so there's a little bit of clashing with like the colors of the avatars and the background color, and you don't know how it's going to look on whatever background color you're using. So to prevent the clashing, there's a few ways to work around this, but like I would just add like a simple like white border just to separate it, just so there's not clashing colors with the background. So something like that would do. Okay, last thing is the footer section. There's not really much going on here, but I always like to end on a dark footer. It just kind of gives you a nice sense of completion. Now it's always fun to like sort of compare the before and after. I know I kind of had a made up example to see what developers would do, but it's always fun to compare. So here's where we started. And here's where we landed. So yeah, and the site's live, so you can like take a look at the code now and see how it was all implemented. It's TUPLE, pairwithtuple.com, I think. Yeah, pairwithtuple.com. Tuple.app. Okay, tuple.app. Thanks, Adam. So yeah, if you joined the talk, you found it useful. Adam and I just launched a book called Refactoring UI. It's loaded with practical tips just like the ones I shared today and a lot more. So you can check that out. And thank you. If you have any questions, come find me in the hall and